بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson 8 in our series on the book Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah of Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah. And in the previous lesson those two issues. The first issue was that when we have any negation in the texts, that negation is not a pure negation in itself, right? So there's no such thing as just a pure negation, meaning that you negate from Allah, for example, that Allah is not deaf, Allah Azza wa Jal is not blind, or Allah Azza wa Jal is not unjust, and that's it. Just a pure negation, right? There's no such thing when it comes to describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with these negations. Rather, what we see in the texts is that not only is there a negation, but also the affirmation of the opposite perfection. So when we say Allah is not unjust, it means we are establishing His perfect justice. If we say Allah is not blind, it establishes His perfect sight, all-inclusive sight. When we say Allah does not become tired or weary, it includes His complete power. So this principle is going to become useful a bit later on when we come to look at the various groups, right? There are 4 groups that we are going to look at, inshaAllah ta'ala. And among those groups, from among those extreme groups, are people who use the principle of describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with pure negation, with pure negations, right? Without affirming for Him any positive attributes. So this clearly is a mistake, it's an error, it's a mistake in the issue of speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it also opposes what has come in the Quran, what is evident in the Quran. So that was the first point that we covered in the previous lesson. And the second issue that we began to discuss, which was really the final point that we are going to speak about in laying all the foundations, is the principle, and this is one of the greatest principles to comprehend in this issue, is al-ishtiraku fil ismi was-sifa la yastalzimu at-tamathul fil musammayat was-sifat, which means that when two things share in the same name, when they're given the same name and the same attribute, this does not necessitate, it does not mean that the realities behind them are the same. This is not necessitated. And so the Shaykh said that this is proven by way of as-sam', which is revelation, and proven by way of reason, and proven just by way of his, meaning just by way of observation. When we observe and look at the things around us, we know that this principle is true and correct, that just because two things have the same name or same label or same attribute, it does not mean that the realities are the same, that they are likenesses in their realities. So in the last lesson, we started looking at this principle, and the Shaykh made the point that this is from the most excellent, most important of principles to comprehend within this particular subject matter. And he said that when it comes to meanings, right, when we ascribe words or labels, those meanings when we attach them to a specific thing, then it becomes unique to that thing, right? And we gave some illustrations, we gave some examples. The Shaykh gives an example here. When we say, for example, the Thawbul Malik, the Thawb of the king, and then when we say, the Thawb of the road sweeper, right, or the Thawb of the butcher, or whatever it might be, the garment of the butcher, we've used the same word or same label, Thawb and Thawb, right? So just because we've used the same label, the same name, the same label, Thawb and Thawb, does that mean that the actual realities of the Thawb of the king and the Thawb of any other profession, that they are going to be the same, like in the material and the style? No, of course not, right? So just because we use the same label of Thawb and Thawb does not mean that the reality is the same. Rather, when we use the word Thawb for the dress of the king, then that word Thawb and what it represents is unique to that king. And when we say the word Thawb, the garment or the whatever it might be, the dress or whatever, for the baker, the butcher, the road sweeper, the whatever, then that word Thawb and what it represents is unique and specific to the individuals that we ascribed it to, right? So this principle here can be proven by way of revelation, and it can be proven by way of reason, and it can be proven by way of just basic observation. And we started in the previous lesson by looking at the first line of evidence, which is the Quran itself, the Quran and Sunnah itself, right? And so from the evidences that Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen brings, and he is basically just summarizing the extensive evidence brought by Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. So the Shaykh gives one example from the Quran in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, Inna Allaha kana sami'an basira. Inna Allaha kana sami'an basira. Indeed, Allah ever is Allah, all hearing and all seeing, or hearing and seeing. So Allah ascribed to himself that he is sami'an basira. However, we also see in the Quran, in Surah Al-Insan, which is the 76th chapter, at the beginning of that chapter, Allah Azza wa Jal, he says, after mentioning how he created, Inna khalaqana al-insan min nutfatin amshaj nabtalih faja'alnahu sami'an basira. Indeed, we created man from a mixture of fluids that we may test him, and we made him to be فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. We made him hearing and seeing. So here on the one hand, Allah has ascribed and described himself سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا, exactly the same labels or names for man, سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. And so this is one example given by the Shaykh. But Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, as we mentioned in the previous lesson, there are 10, 12, 13 pages of examples that Ibn Taymiyyah brings, of so many examples in the Quran where Allah is ascribing something to himself, such as life and knowledge and a will and being pleased and being angry, and the same things he is ascribing to the creatures, to the creation, right? So upon that, the principle is, all of this returns back to that verse that we mentioned, Laysa kamithlihi shay wa huwa as-sami'ul basir. Right? So this principle that we are speaking of here, that sharing in the name and the attribute, the label of the name and the attribute, does not necessitate that the realities are the same. And this verse is the actual principle. This is where we are taking this principle from. Because Allah said in this ayah, there is nothing which is a likeness to him, and he is the hearing, the seeing. Right? He is the hearing and the seeing. So he called himself Sami' al-Basir and Sami'an Basira in other verses, yet he also called man Sami'an Basira, hearing and seeing. But then he said, Laysa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing which is a likeness to him. This is a direct proof, right? So this is evidence for this principle from the Quran. This verse is chapter 42, verse 11. Chapter 42, verse 11. This is a statement of the principle itself. So when we say al-ishtiraku fil ismi wa sifa, sharing in the name and the attribute, the actual words, لا يستلزم التماثل في المسميات والصفات, does not necessitate likeness in the name, in the realities. It's this verse which is actually making that principle, right? Making this principle, making this statement effectively. So the Shaykh, in expanding upon this, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, he says that this is a very, very important principle by which many doubts and difficulties that we come across when we discuss this topic, they are resolved when we understand this principle, right? And you will find in experience that when you go and discuss with an Ash'ari and a Maturidi and people from the people of Kalam, of philosophy and rhetoric, this is what they are getting confused about. This is what they are getting confused about, right? They are seeing that we affirm for Allah something that Allah has affirmed for Himself, and then they see that the creation is also described with it. And then they wrongly presume that this necessitates the realities must be the same, and then they start denying what Allah has affirmed for Himself, right? So this principle is very important, and the Shaykh says this is from the doubts that the people of innovation, the people who negate things from Allah, the people who distort the texts, they are the ones who think that agreement in name and attribute necessitates agreement in the reality. And this, no doubt, is a false presumption. It is incorrect. It is incorrect. And, even the Shaykh says, even the common person, he would not understand this understanding. Even a common person, right? He's not going to fall into this mistake that these people are falling into, right? So you might ask, how come these apparently intelligent people, learned people who've looked at philosophy and this, and they can't understand this, yet a common man, an army, right, he's able to understand this? Well, the reason is because the common man has not had his common sense and his fitrah, his common sense and his reason to be polluted and to be distorted and to be poisoned by way of philosophy and rhetoric and so on and so forth. And that's why sometimes you will find that the most apparently intelligent and shrewd of people, they will find it very hard to grasp something that the common person, the man who sells fruit, the man who sells vegetables, the man who sweeps the road, he will grasp in an instant, right? And you will come across and experience these realities. So the Shaykh says that I have already given you an example of the thobe, of the garment, right? So when we say the garment of the king and the garment of the pauper or the beggar or the road sweeper, just because the word garment is the same does not mean that the realities behind them are the same. Of course not. And we all clearly understand that. Anyhow, the Shaykh goes on to speak about the actual evidence that we just mentioned about from the Quran, that Allah is Sami'an Basira, man is Sami'an Basira. This is an example of a name, right? These are names. Sami' Basir, Sami' Basir. So the Shaykh said, so this is one example given. The second example given is the example of knowledge. And in fact, we gave this example in the previous lesson. We said that when you say the knowledge of a worm, the knowledge of a an ant, the knowledge of a spider, the knowledge of a cat or a dog, right? In each instance, we know that each of these creatures has of the meaning of knowledge what is suitable and appropriate for its existence and for it to do what it's supposed to do, right? We also have the knowledge of man and the knowledge of an angel and also the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In all of these instances, we've ascribed knowledge as an attribute to all these different entities. Does that necessitate now that the reality of the knowledge that we ascribe to an ant or a spider is the same as the reality of the knowledge that we ascribe to man or to an angel or the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Of course not. Of course not. And so that's why in the Quran, we see that from the examples of attributes ascribed to both man and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the issue of knowledge. Allah says, علم الله أنكم ستذكرونهن. That Allah knows that you are going to remember them. Right? Allah knows. علم الله. But Allah also says, فَإِنْ عَلِمْتُمُوهُنَّ مُؤْمِنَاتٍ. Like if you know these women, if you have knowledge that these women are believing women, then don't send them back to the people, to the disbelievers, right? So Allah affirmed for himself ilm, and he affirmed for man ilm. Allah knows, man knows. So here is the ilm the same. We see that in other verses of the Quran, a clear difference is made between Allah's knowledge and the knowledge of other than Him. Because Allah says in the Quran also, وَسِعَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا. وَسِعَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا. Allah has encompassed knowledge of everything. Right? So Allah's knowledge being different to the knowledge of a man is itself indicated in the Quran. He also said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَخْفَى عَلَيْهِ شَيْءٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا فِي السَّمَاءِ. There is nothing which is hidden from Allah. Nothing is hidden from Allah in the heavens or the earth. So this is like another difference between the knowledge of man and the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are many other verses. أَأَنْتُمْ أَعْلَمُ أَمِ اللَّهِ. Are you more knowledgeable or is Allah? Right? So here what we see is that in the Quran, Allah affirms for Himself hearing, seeing, knowledge, and many other attributes. And He affirms for man also the same things. This is what Allah Himself, this is from His speech. Yet at the same time He said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. So this means it is impossible for the realities to be the same. And there's no caution, there's no problem for us to say that Allah hears, Allah sees, Allah ascends above His throne, Allah becomes angry, Allah becomes pleased, because these are things Allah has ascribed to Himself. And we know that the realities can never ever be the same. So anyhow, this is evidence from the Quran, very, very clearly. This is evidence from the Quran. This is the first line of evidence. And the second line of evidence now is from reason. Is from aql, from reason. Reason also tells us that this principle is correct and true. And so the Shaykh says, وَأَمَّا الْأَقْلِ. As for reason, فَمِنَ الْمَعْلُومِ بِالْأَقْلِ أَنَّ الْمَعَانِي وَالْأَوْصَافِ تَتَقَيَّدُ وَتَتَمَيَّزُ بِحَسَبِ مَا تُضَافُ إِلَيْهِ. So he says, it is known from reason that meanings and descriptions are tied and distinguished in accordance to what they are attached to what they are ascribed to. Right? So really here the same example can be given. The same example that we just gave about knowledge. When you say the spider has knowledge, the ant has knowledge, right? The cat has knowledge, the dog has knowledge, the elephant has knowledge, man has knowledge, right? And an angel has knowledge. This we know through reason, that each time we've used the word ilm, knowledge, in no way does this mean that the reality of that knowledge is the same for every entity. Rather, we clearly understand, when I say the knowledge of the ant, or the knowledge of the shark in the ocean, the awareness and the knowledge, we all know and we all understand that that knowledge and its reality is tied only to the thing that I'm ascribing it to, right? And then when I say a knowledge of an angel, a knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that knowledge and the meaning of that knowledge and the reality of that knowledge is connected only to the being or the entity to which I've ascribed it to. And we all know and we all understand this very, very clearly. And we could do the same with power, the qudra, right? We say, the power of the ant, or the power of, the elephant, or the power of whatever it might be. And every time we use the word qudra, power, we know that the reality is different in each and every case. So the Shaykh says that the meanings and the descriptions تتقيد وتتميز, right? They are restricted to and they are distinguished only for that thing to which they are described. And then he says, فَكَمَا أَنَّ الْأَشْيَاء مُخْتَلِفَةٌ فِي ذَوَاتِهَا فَإِنَّهَا كَذَلِكَ مُخْتَلِفَةٌ فِي صِفَاتِهَا. So just like we know that entities are different in their essences, right? Entities are different in their essences. So, you can have, for example, you have water, you have wood, you have steel, you have different things. And each of those possesses, for example, water has a type of strength. Water has power, has strength. Just like wood has strength, just like metal has strength. But the meaning of the word power and quwwah in each instance is actually different. Water has power and it's manifested in a way other than wood might have power. For example, wood can burn, and wood also has, obviously it has hardness as well, but it can also burn, and it has power in that sense. So the point being that just like entities, as the Shaykh says, they differ in the actual essences, right? In the actual essence of the thing they differ, they therefore also differ in the attributes they possess. And likewise in the meanings ascribed to them as well. Pay attention to that. He said, just like فَكَمَا أَنَّ الْأَشْيَاء مُخْتَلِفَةٌ فِي ذَوَاتِهَا فَإِنَّهَا كَذَلِكَ مُخْتَلِفَةٌ فِي صِفَاتِهَا وَفِي الْمَعَانِي الْمُضَافَةِ إِلَيْهَا. Just like things differ in their essences, they also differ in the attributes ascribed to them and in the meanings ascribed to them as well. Right? So, going back to that same example, when I say power, the power of water, you all know that the meaning of power here and the manifestation of that power is different to when I say the power of wood or the power of steel, right? Or the power of lightning, for example. In each case, the word is the same, quwwah, qudra. But the realities and the meanings, even the ma'na is even though there's a shared meaning, there's an aslul ma'na, there's a shared meaning, even the meanings vary depending on what entity you ascribe the attribute to, right? So this is very, very, very clear and very apparent. So the Shaykh continues, فَإِنَّ صِفَةَ كُلِّ مَوْصُوفٍ تُنَاسِبُهُ لا يفهم منها ما يقصر عن موصوفها أو يتجاوزه. Right? So the Shaykh says that because of this reality that meanings are unique and specific to the thing that we are ascribing the attribute to or the name to, then we can't either fall short or exaggerate, right? We don't fall short, nor do we exaggerate. So, for example, if we were to say, is the knowledge of a man equal to the knowledge of a sheep? Do we make the knowledge of a man like the knowledge of a sheep? If we claim that, we have now fallen short, right? This now is, we've now fallen short, right? But if we say the knowledge of a man is like the knowledge of an angel, or the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've now gone beyond the limits. We've gone beyond the limits, right? So when it comes to this issue, we neither fall short nor do we go beyond the limit, right? And this, if we stick to this principle and we understand this principle, that sharing in the names and attributes like the labels does not necessitate sharing in the realities, it means that we will only describe things and understand things according to their realities. According to their realities. Likewise, the Shaykh gives the example as well, that if I said so-and-so is an alim, so-and-so is an alim, right? And this is like a common person. And then I also said, Shaykhul Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah is an alim, right? Then all of you understand that the meaning of alim for the first person is not the same meaning as an alim for the second person, right? And even though both of them are humans, they are both, they are both men. So the point being that sifatu kulli mawsufin tanasibuhu, right? The attribute of everyone described with it is suitable and appropriate for it, right? Until even the action. So this applies to attributes, it also applies to actions as well, right? Because Allah has actions as well. So by way of example, the Shaykh gives the illustration here. If I said, لو قلت عن طفل صغير إنه حمل حجرا بمشقة, if I was to say that there's this little child, young child, and he lifted up this rock, and he did it with great difficulty, right? So he lifted a rock, and he did so with great difficulty. Okay, now I say about a very strong, youthful man, strapping youthful man, that he lifted a rock and he did so with great difficulty. Right. You would not understand now, you would never understand here, that just because both of them lifted a rock and they found great difficulty, that the rock was exactly the same. Right? You would never understand that, right? Even though the action itself was exactly the same. The child is doing the same action, the powerful, strong man is doing the same action, right? So, point being that the fa'il is different, right? And so even when it comes to the actions, then the same applies. So what do we have? We have names, the asma, we have sifat, attributes, and we have af'al, actions, right? So this also means that the action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in whatever He does, in the way He manifests His power, in the way He manifests His wisdom, in the way He, from the various actions that He does, creates, provides, gives life, takes life, right? There is no likeness between the actions of Allah and our actions, right? So in all of these three things, names, attributes, actions, the Shaykh has given us examples, plenty of examples, to illustrate this point. Then also, the Shaykh said, وَلِهَذَا نَصِفُ الْإِنسَانُ بِاللِّينِ وَالْحَدِيدِ الْمُنْصَحِرِ بِاللِّينِ وَنَعْلَمُ أَنَّ اللِّينِ متفاوت المعنى بحسب ما أضيف إليه. The Shaykh gives yet another example. Which is that if you were to say about this word lean means gentleness and softness. So in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ, which means it is by the mercy of Allah that you, O Muhammad, were gentle and soft with them. You were gentle and soft with them. لِنْتَ لَهُمْ. So here, a type of gentleness and softness has been ascribed to man. But then we see in another verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's speaking about iron. And He says, وَأَلَنَّا لَهُ الْحَدِيدِ. Speaking about Sulaiman, the Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, that we made soft for him the iron. Right? The iron being made soft by way of fire. You heat it up and then it's very easily malleable and it becomes gentle and soft and you can shape it. Right? So here, the attribute of lean in Arabic meaning gentleness, softness. We clearly understand that when we ascribe this gentleness and softness to a man, that is different to the gentleness and softness that we ascribe to iron. Right? Very, 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 very clear. So just because the same word is being used, lean or layyin, then there is a very clear difference between them. All right? So this now is the second line of reasoning, or the second line of evidence. Very, very apparent and very, very clear from reason. Right? What are we establishing? We're establishing the principle that just because we use the same name or the same label for an attribute for different things does not mean that the realities are the same. Right? And if we can accept this for things within Allah's creation, then how much more so does it apply between the creation and the creator, right? Meaning that if we can clearly understand that when we say, the knowledge of a spider or the power of a spider and the knowledge of a man or the knowledge of an angel or the power of an elephant or the power of a lion, we know that in all of these instances that the meaning of knowledge and power is unique to each thing and there's no likeness. If we can accept that, then how much more so is this applicable between the creation and between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so this is the principle that we see all of these groups, these people of misguidance, that they are confused regarding this issue. And once we clearly understand this issue, a lot of the confusion in this subject of Allah's names and His attributes and His actions will be removed. This now leads us to the third line of evidence. And this is al-hiss. Al-hiss meaning sensory perception. Which means just pure observation. Just pure observation in itself. And the Shaykh says that فإننا نشاهد للفيل جسما وقدما وقوة وللبعوضة جسما وقدما وقوة ونعلم الفرق بين جسميهما وقدميهما وقوتيهما. So he says, we can observe an elephant on the one hand, which the elephant has, it has a being, it has strength and power, it has whatever features it has, of the feet and whatever else. And then we can also look at a fly. We see the fly has like a being, like its particular body, and it has its feet, and it has its strength. And we clearly know the difference between the two. That the realities are clearly different, even though the labels are the same. So we the Shaykh goes on to make the point that when we know that sharing in the name and the attribute, as in the labels, between created beings does not necessitate that the realities are the same, and these are all created things, then the fact that this is denied for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala between Him and His creation, then that is even more so, right? Even more so. Meaning even more so we can accept that when we say Allah is hearing, seeing, Allah becomes pleased, Allah becomes angry, right? That there's no likeness whatsoever between that and between how we find these things amongst the creation. And the Shaykh says, rather, this type of likeness, بل التماثل في ذلك بين الخالق والمخلوق ممتنع غاية الامتناع. Rather, this is something that is impossible. It is impossible for there to be a likeness between Allah and between His creation, despite the names and the labels being the same. Right? Allah is hearing, Allah is seeing. Man is hearing, man is seeing. Allah has knowledge, man has knowledge. Allah has power, man has power. Allah has life, man has life. Right? There's no likeness. It is impossible for there to be any likeness. And this is because we do not know the reality of Allah's essence, Allah's being. We cannot have that knowledge. It is impossible for us to know and fathom and grasp that. And because we do not have knowledge of the reality of Allah's essence and His being, then we don't know how His attributes are with His essence or with His being. It's impossible for us to know that. Right? So this is the third line of evidence that the Shaykh brings. And he then summarizes and basically says that we have presented three lines of evidence to show that there cannot be any likeness between Allah and His creation, despite the same names, the same attributes, and the same words for actions being shared between Allah and His creation. Right? There's no likeness. It is impossible for there to be any. And it is not necessitated that they have to be the same. So after this, the Shaykh then very quickly summarizes all three evidences. He said, the first evidence that we brought is the evidence from revelation. Right? And when we have evidence from the revelation, no one can deny that evidence. It is not for any believing man or believing woman, when Allah and His Messenger decide on a matter, for them to have any choice therein. The Shaykh brings this ayah from the Quran. وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. In Surah Al-Ahzab, Surah 33, verse 36. Right? So the revelation is sufficient as evidence to prove this point. However, there's also the evidence of reason, al-aql. So what is al-aql? What is reason? Reason is something that is present with us, right? Because it is connected to life and to the soul, right? So long as the soul is present, then you have the faculty of reason. And, so for reason, you just need to apply your reason, as the Shaykh says. Right? You don't need to travel here and there and see and observe things. You just apply your reason. So we gave the evidence of reason. And we know from reason that things vary in their realities. And even if the same labels are given, the realities are different. And thirdly, he said, al-hiss. Al-hiss means that you have to be able to observe and see. And, you have to obviously travel and move around and observe and see. This is how you know the differences between things. So this kind of brings us to an end for this final section. And what I want to do now is I want to so we all understand the foundations that we've laid down so far, because all of this now is the foundation for what is going to come next. So if we grasp these things really well, then what follows, it'll be easy for us to understand. So I'm going to summarize everything in 6 points. So these are 6 things that will summarize what we've learned so far, right? And here what we are establishing is what is the method of the Quran, what is the methodology of the Quran in how we speak about Allah, our Lord and our Creator. What is the method of the Quran? And we can summarize this in 6 points. The first point is that we affirm for Allah whatever He affirmed for Himself. Right? Because Allah is most knowledgeable of Himself. And because we have not seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so therefore knowledge of Allah can only come by way of khabar. It can only come by way of report, meaning by way of revelation from a prophet, a messenger, right? So upon that basis, we describe Allah with whatever He described Himself with. And we stick to those words that Allah used, right? Secondly, the same applies with respect to negation, right? That we negate for Allah whatever Allah negated from Himself. We negate for Allah whatever Allah negated from Himself. So we follow exactly the same principle when it comes to negating things from Allah. We only negate for Allah whatever He negated for Himself in exactly the same words. Right? That's the second principle. And we do these 2 things, affirming and negating, without falling into 4 things. Right? We do not fall into ta'til, which means to negate what Allah described Himself with, ta'til, nor do we make tahrif, nor do we start distorting what He affirmed for Himself, start distorting and changing the meaning, nor do we make tamthil, nor do we liken what Allah described Himself with what is in the creation, nor do we make takyif, which is start delving into how is Allah's hearing, how is Allah's seeing, how is Allah's knowledge, how is Allah's essence, right? So these 4 things we do not do, right? So these are the first 2 principles. In fact, we can put it into 7. I'll add another one. There's 7 principles altogether. The third principle is that we absolutely must combine between affirmation and negation. Right? When it comes to speaking about Allah, we have to use both affirmation and negation together. Right? Because this is what the Quran came with. Allah affirms for Himself and He also negates from Himself. And you cannot have Tawheed, except by combining these 2 things together. Right? You cannot have Tawheed except by combining these 2 things together. Affirmation and negation. That's the third point. The fourth point is that when we look in the Quran and the Sunnah, affirmation is always specific and detailed. Affirmation is specific and detailed. So when we look in the Quran, we see Allah describes Himself as, Rabbul Alameen, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Malik, Al-Quddus, As-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, Al-Aziz, Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir, Al-Sami, Al-Alim, Al-Hakim, Al-Aziz, Al-Quddus. Right? These are all specifics. And the same with attributes. Allah mentions attributes specific to Himself, right? So we find that when you affirm something, you affirm specifically and in detail, because this implies praise, it implies perfection, and it brings about love in the heart for the one being described with these things. So affirmation is always detailed, specific, varied, right? Fifth, negation is always general. Negation is always general, right? So we negate from Allah in a general sense, because this is greater in perfection. Greater in perfection, right? So remember, we gave examples. We said, if you said, there is, like in the Quran, Allah says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," and "Walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad." There's nothing like Allah, like unto Allah. Allah does not have any equal, right? And He left it general. وَلَمْ يَكُلْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. There's none which is an equal to Allah. But if I came along and said, there's none which is an equal to Allah in His knowledge, even though that's true, I've now particularized the negation to one thing, right? And so this now implies that, okay, no one is equal to Allah in His knowledge, but that leaves the possibility that maybe, there are those who are equal to Allah in other things, right? So negation, when it is made general and made absolute, this is greater in affirming the uniqueness and the greatness and the perfection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So, وَلَمْ يَكُلْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. Negation in a general sense. This is different to affirmation. Affirmation has to be specific and, particular, right? So you can't just say Allah is unique and Allah is perfect and Allah, that's it. Make a general type of affirmation. No, you have to say Allah is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Qudus, as I said, Al-Latif, Al-Latif, Al-Khabir. And the more of these names, the more of these attributes that you mention, the more the perfection is indicated and manifested, right? So this is point number 5. And then obviously we said there are exceptions to these two. This is still part and parcel of point number 4 and point number 5. That in general the rule is affirmation is specific and detailed. In general the rule is that negation is done in a general sense. But there are specific exceptions, as we said, when Allah negates something specifically from Himself, that's because of a reason to do so. Allah negates that He has a son, because the Christians ascribed a son to Him. Allah negates that He is poor and needy, right? Because the Jews made that claim against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah is faqir, Allah is in need, right? So negation in specific does happen, but it is the exception to the rule, because that negation, there's a reason for that negation to be made. Anyhow, this is number 5. Number 6 is what we covered in the previous lesson, that there's no such thing as just a pure negation in and of itself, right? Rather, every time there is a negation in the Quran and the Sunnah, it implies the perfect opposite, right? So Allah negates from Himself a son. This means Allah is Al-Ahad As-Samad. He is one, the one who is not in need of anything else, right? Allah is not, Allah is not in need, because He is Al-Ghani, the perfect opposite. Allah does not become, لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. He's not overtaken by sleep nor slumber, because obviously He is the perfect. He is Al-Qayyum. He is Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum. He is the ever living, the one who maintains everything. Right? So every time there is a negation, by necessity there is attached to it the opposite, which is the perfect opposite. And so, as we said, on this point, we find that there are certain groups of misguidance who describe Allah only with pure negatives and nothing else. They will not admit the perfect opposite. So they will say Allah is not deaf, Allah is not blind, Allah is not ignorant, but they will not speak in affirmation that Allah is all hearing, all seeing, and all knowing, because of a misconception that they have, that if you describe any positive attribute to Allah, then that means you've turned him into a body. And the reason is because in the world that we see around us, we do not see anything which has hearing, seeing, and knowledge, except that we find it in a body. So because that's our experience, then if we ascribe these same things to Allah, it means Allah must be a body. This is faulty reasoning, and we're going to look at that in the next lesson, inshallah ta'ala. This is faulty reasoning. So therefore, some of these groups, they take the approach that will describe Allah only in pure negatives, and that's it. Allah is not deaf, Allah is not blind, Allah is not ignorant, Allah is not unjust, Allah is not incapable. And then they'll make a long list of negations. And by making pure negations, you are not affirming anything. You are not affirming anything. This is just, nafi mahd. It's just pure negation. So anyway, this was point number 6. And point number 7 is what we discussed today, which is basically al-ishtirak fil ismi was sifa la yastalzimu at-tamathul fil musammayat was sifat. Right? Just because things have the same name given to them and the same attribute, like the same label, does not mean that the realities that they point to are the same. Right? And this principle is proven by way of revelation from the Quran itself, and by way of reason, and also by way of just sensory observation, just by looking and observing entities and the differences between them and the things which they share in terms of labels and attributes, and the realities are different. Right? So basically, these 6 or 7 points are the essential key points which explain what the Quran has come with as a methodology in the way that we speak about and describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so if we grasp all of these things, then inshallah, when we move to the next stage now, which is looking at all of the groups who have deviated and erred in this subject matter, then we will be able to very clearly see how they are opposing the truth, what's the nature of their mistake, which principle are they actually violating, and how are they violating that principle. Right? So this is what we should be able to grasp very easily now that these basic foundations have been laid down in this manner. So we can round off today's lesson with that, inshallah ta'ala. What is to come next is, the next sections, which will take us maybe, quite a few lessons, is we're now going to look at the people who deviated, those who exaggerated and made likenesses between Allah and His creation, on the one hand, and those who fell into negation and who denied for Allah what Allah affirmed for Himself. And we'll be looking at different factions and groups amongst them, and the nature of their error, the nature of their mistake, inshallah ta'ala. So we'll bring today's lesson to a close. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.